to share more about the work of the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, which is a collective project that I helped start in 2013. So we're 10 years old this year, which is weird. Makes me feel old. But I also just want to preface that all of the work that I'm sharing is collective. So none of it's just mine. It might seem like it is because I'm talking about it, but everything is collective and collaborative. And if I listed the names of everybody who would be, I should reference in referencing this work, that would take 2 hours. So you might see some other names pop up in some of these maps and projects, but I just wanted to start with that. And I'm really going to just go through a slideshow again and explain who we are, how we came to be, what we do, and how we're trying to use maps and data and also stories in order to fight gentrification and to help grow housing justice spaces, mostly in the San Francisco Bay Area, New York City, and Los Angeles in the US. I've also done some work with the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project in Romania, which I'll talk about a little bit. But I'm just going to start with kind of our origin story to help kind of get us on the same page. Again, if anything I'm saying is confusing, please raise your hand. Feel free to ask. Like, I don't want this to just be like a lecture. So this is, it should be more of a conversation. And I know it's like, maybe you can't see me with this here and I need to talk into the mic. So I might just be kind of like wandering around like this. I don't know. But let's see how this goes. Okay. So for starters, a lot of what I'm showing is on our website, anti-evictionmap.com. Not everything, but if I reference a map and you might want to find it, you likely can find it on our website. But I just wanted to start here. Just by giving a little bit of context as to why and when we started 10 years ago in San Francisco. So this was this moment that a lot of people call the tech boom 2.0 or the second .com boom. There was the first .com boom in the Bay Area, also in other cities in the late 90s and early 2000s, right, with the dawn of new web-based and internet-based industries. There was the foreclosure crisis. And then kind of right after the foreclosure crisis, a lot of new tech started investing in San Francisco and Silicon Valley. So this was this moment in 2008 that Airbnb and Uber launched in San Francisco, kind of a startup economy. Lyft formed soon after. Places like this SF Mart, which was an old store, basically became the headquarters of Twitter. The public hospital in San Francisco got rebranded the Zuckerberg San Francisco Hospital and Trauma Center. So now if you're injured in San Francisco and need to go to the public hospital, you go to the Zuckerberg San Francisco General Hospital. And even areas like West Oakland, which have been historically Black and working class, got rebranded as this like new edge of Silicon Valley. So all of this was happening. And as a housing organizer at the time, I was part of a group called Eviction Free San Francisco. We were a mutual aid direct action collective. So we would produce direct actions with different tenants who were being evicted. We started to notice these new trends, like very much correlative to this tech boom. So I'm just going to share a little bit. Well, here, one of the trends we started noticing was, and I don't know if this is going to work, was that these Google buses appeared overnight. They're still in San Francisco. I don't know if you've ever heard of them, but they're basically these large luxury limousine buses. Somebody called them like overlords that just roam through the streets and pick up Silicon Valley workers and transport them to Silicon Valley, which is south of San Francisco. It'd be about an hour, drive if you're going to Mountain View or Palo Alto or something like that. But what we started to see was that tech companies started saying, come move to San Francisco. And instead of having to live in the boring suburbs, you can live in this cool hip city, or you can live in the Mission District, which is a historically Latinx working class neighborhood. And we'll provide these luxury buses to take you to Silicon Valley. And while buses are good, what we started to see is wherever these bus stops were to pick up the tech workers, that's where evictions would spike, and that's where rents would go up. So with Eviction Free San Francisco and some other groups, there was one called the Heart of the City Collective. We started engaging in a lot of these sort of bus blockades. And I don't know if the audio is working, maybe not. You don't need the audio for this, but this just will show you a little bit about what it was like there then. We would gather and basically blockade these tech buses, and tenants who were being evicted near these tech buses would start sharing their stories and explaining what it was like to be living in this sort of hyper gentrified city. And sometimes we would only block the buses for like 5 minutes. Sometimes it would be a couple hours, but it was really a way that tenants started to feel more empowered to fight back against gentrification and come together and realize that there was, collectivity and that they weren't alone in going through or facing eviction. So sorry, that's me. But so anyway, oops. So with Eviction Free San Francisco, we started blocking these buses. We also started noticing in our meetings that increasingly tenants didn't know who their landlords even were who were evicting them. And this is a trend that lots of folks have experienced in the aftermaths of the foreclosure crisis. So after 2008, big Wall Street investment companies began, purchasing all these homes that had been foreclosed upon, many of which had been foreclosed upon and then sold at auction. And, these big banks were involved. But then big investment companies like Blackstone and Invitation Homes would then purchase homes afterwards, after they had been foreclosed. Often they would purchase them at auction and turn them into single family rentals. This was happening all over the US. It was happening in Spain. It was happening in many different countries. And, now Blackstone is doing all this work with the University of California system. So they're everywhere. Probably some of you have heard of them. But what we started to notice in San Francisco was it wasn't Blackstone, but actually these kind of smaller, but nevertheless corporate landlords were purchasing multifamily rentals, so kind of like big apartment buildings, with these anonymous sounding shell companies, and then evicting tenants. And the goal was to get the tenants out and then sell each unit at the condo and make a lot of money. And so this became this trend that we became aware of in our organizing work. And what was hard was that every time this would happen, it wouldn't be, maybe this will actually, oops, I'm just going. I know you can't really see this very well, but it wouldn't be Urban Green Investments, which was this big corporation that would, their name wouldn't be on the eviction notices, but rather one of their shell companies. So Urban Green Investments was a really big corporation at the time. They started purchasing all these buildings with cash, but each building would get purchased through like 55 Dolores Street LLC, limited liability company, or 49 Guerrero Street LLC, or 1070 Post Street LLC. And so tenants living in these buildings didn't actually know that they were all being evicted by the same landlord. And so this sort of need for information about corporate ownership and evictions really was the impetus behind the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project launching and getting going. And I just thought I'd show this map because it was a really early map that we made using the Olographer tool that Little Sis has designed. And I know they're going to be talking later. So I just wanted to share this because, there's really interesting relationships between some of the projects that are here today. But this was this kind of map that we made through this very analog fashion to show all of the banks and properties and people and even right-wing think tanks like the Aspen Institute that were kind of part of this network behind various evictions, including this eviction at 55 Dolores Street that was being executed by 55 Dolores Street LLC, the shell company of Urban Green. And that was an eviction struggle that I was really personally involved in. This woman, Mary Elizabeth Phillips, who was 97 years old at the time, got an eviction notice from 55 Dolores Street LLC. And Mary, and she lived in one of 6 units in this building. Mary didn't, but her neighbors started coming to our meetings and we decided to fight back. And through research, we were able to figure out, okay, you're a subsidiary, your landlord's a subsidiary of this big investment company. And we started building a campaign with different folks in different buildings across the city being evicted by the same corporate landlord. And through direct action, we were actually able to get Urban Green to back off and not evict Mary. And she was allowed to live the rest of her life out in her home. She made it to 100 when she passed away. Urban Green flipped all the units. And so now you can see on the right, all 6 of those units are, we kind of did some door knocking, investigative research, and you can see they're all homes of tech employees. And again, this is all based up before the kind of downturn of the tech industry that is happening now. So maybe we'll see what happens, but nevertheless, tech gentrification continues to be real. So one of the things we began doing early on in the mapping project is creating these really basic static web pages that don't really do anything other than list all the different shell companies associated with these different humans that are actually behind investment companies. So this guy, William Rossetti, his name doesn't appear on any eviction notices in Oakland, but nevertheless, these companies that he's a part of on the right were a part of over 4,000 eviction notices filed between 2008 and 2015. And so people didn't really think of him as an evictor, but everybody knew about, what is it, J&R Land and Cattle Company LP. So we started making these web pages on our website. And it's actually still to date when we look and try to analyze what websites or web pages on our website are being used the most. It's always these pages, because what we think is that people are like, oh, who is this LLC? They look it up, and these humans are trying to hide. They don't want anybody to know who they are. So this often will pop up as the first page. So this is something we continue to do, and we're trying to do better. But it is a way that we can use sometimes digital technology, as flawed as it can be, to create information that can be used to actually fight what's going on the ground. So, and this guy is he was part of the mayor's housing cabinet, the last mayor in Oakland. So an influential guy. So this is actually the very first geospatial map that we ever made in San Francisco. And again, we started working in San Francisco. A lot of us lived and worked in Oakland, so we started working in Oakland too. So really both sides of the Bay. They're different cities, but and also have really different histories, which I can get into. But there is a lot of shared community and different groups that work on both sides of the Bay in both cities. So we started working in both. This is a map that we made early on in San Francisco, which shows the accumulation of a particular type of eviction unique to California called the Ellis Act. It shows the accumulation of eviction notices through the Ellis Act over time. And I'm not going to get into all the legal jargon around the Ellis Act, but the sort of short version is that, different cities in the US and in California have rent control, which means that rent can't go up more than a couple percentage points a year. Generally, they also have what are called just cause protections. And those were all won through housing struggles, largely in the 70s, the late 1970s and early 80s. And anyway, so after that happened, different cities in California, suddenly it became harder for landlords to evict tenants if tenants did nothing wrong. Landlords had to have a just cause reason to evict tenants. So basically, if you don't pay your rent on time, or you, are considered a nuisance, which is often very racially coded. There are different what are called fault evictions that landlords use, but there are also no fault evictions, which means that people get evicted for doing nothing wrong. And what happened was it became harder to do no fault evictions after cities gained rent control and tenant protections. So this trust fund kid who owned a building in Santa Monica, which had just gained rent control, he inherited a building from his mother filled with tenants. He didn't want to be a landlord, so he just wanted to evict them, but he couldn't because there were these tenant protections. He befriended the state senator, Jim Ellis, and together they wrote this thing called the Ellis Act, which allows landlords to basically evict tenants for doing nothing wrong at all. So you could be like Mary, who I mentioned earlier, Mary Elizabeth Phillips. She got an Ellis Act eviction notice after, living in her home for, I think, 40 years and always being a quote unquote good tenant, which is still also a problematic category that we're trying to interrogate. But nevertheless, what we're seeing is that often when tenant protections get enacted, landlords look for some sort of loophole, and then we have to fight to help close that loophole. So it becomes this ongoing kind of battle. The Ellis Act is still a big problem in different cities in California, more so in San Francisco than Oakland. And it's disproportionately used by real estate speculators. So when we look at the LLCs, the corporations, what kinds of eviction notices they're using, it's often the Ellis Act, because it enables them to then flip the unit and evict tenants for doing nothing wrong and then sell each unit as a condo. One of the stipulations with the Ellis Act is you can't re-rent it after you evict. So it's kind of prime for somebody wanting to get tenants out and sell those. But anyway, this is this map we made. It's the first map I ever made. I didn't know what I was doing. But what you can do is, hover over a dot and see who the owner is if we were able to figure it out. We were doing a lot of this research by getting data from the local rent board. So cities with rent control often have rent boards, which generally have what are called eviction filing petitions. So if a landlord intends to evict, they file it with the rent board. And it doesn't mean that the eviction was executed. These shell companies that would often be the ones listed on these eviction notices. We've gotten a lot better at this. I'll show you how we do it now, but this was how we were doing it early on. We only had eviction data early on. Now we have more data. Sorry, this Zoom thing is kind of, let's see if I put it here. Okay. So we made these stencils that the tenants here forced out and just started like handing them out in different meetings. And what was cool was that people started to use the map, which at the time was the first map of evictions that went public in San Francisco, to mark on the streets where evictions had taken place. And this became a really important thing for us early on, was to create a relationship between the digital and the analog, if you want to call it that, but to really show offline where some of our online maps might take somebody, to kind of create that conversation and to mark in real physical space where evictions have taken place, which is of course something that if a landlord or a property manager knows that an eviction had taken place somewhere, they don't want to advertise it because it's going to make, he wants to move into a place where a brutal eviction had just taken place. Some people, but not everybody. So we were trying to make it harder for them by marking these buildings, and then they would go around with like white paint and throw the paint on our stencils, and then we would stencil back, and so that became another sort of thing. And other people do this. We're not like alone in doing this, but this is just one way that we found to make this digital map have legs on the ground. So, all right. We also realized early on that after making that first map, we were reducing really complex stories to these dots, right? These eviction notices. And we wanted to complicate that and think about the stories of displacement and also resistance that tenants themselves have experienced. Each eviction notice, it's not just an eviction notice, it's like somebody's life or multiple people's lives and communities and neighborhoods. And we just thought it was really hard to kind of do justice to that with some of our early, more kind of positivist mapping. So we began to embed oral histories and also little video clips of different tenants who either had been evicted or maybe who were still in their homes because they fought back and were able to be there. And that was important too for us because we wanted to show that it was possible to resist, and that just because you receive an eviction notice I'm looking for one story, it doesn't mean that you necessarily are going to be evicted. I mean, it's harder to stay put, but it is possible to resist. So some are videos, some are audio. I could just play a little clip here, maybe, except, wait, sorry. Here, I'll do Elsa's story. This is somebody named Elsa who was part of our project early on. He wasn't evicted, but grew up in the Mission. And
I was born and raised in San Francisco. And I currently live with my parents and my family on 16th and South Van Ness in the Mission District. And I've lived in that studio since I was 1. So my family came to San Francisco, I would say in the late 80s. Both my parents are from Guadalajara, Mexico. And they met there. They were both working at a Hershey's chocolate factory. And they decided to get married, and they had my older brother over there. When they came here, or shortly after they came here, they both started working as house cleaners. And that's what they did for most of the time while I was growing up. And I remember me and my sisters would go with them a lot to clean houses. And so I'm the first one to be born here. And after that, all of my younger siblings were born here. I guess my favorite part of the neighborhood is that I feel like it is a real community, and I feel that community has been a really big part of who I am and how I've been raised. And I like how it feels that I know everything in the neighborhood. I know where everything is. And it feels nice that my parents have connections to people around the mission, and I know a lot of people who live there, have a lot of friends. It has mostly been like a working class immigrant neighborhood, and I think that's what a lot of people know it as. So, and I think it's unique because a lot of the immigrants, folks there have like really kind of like made their mark in the mission. They set up all these stores and they paint murals and they do birthday parties at the park. Everyone walks around and knows each other. So I feel like everyone has used that neighborhood to help each other out and to just build something new, which is the mission. I think what makes it unique now is the fact that it's like really being gentrified very rapidly. And like whenever you hear people talk about gentrification in San Francisco, the mission is one of the places that, really stands out. I mean, I feel like it's been changing for a long time now. I remember learning the term gentrification when I was in middle school. So there's a lot of things already happening then. There's a lot of stores that have been closed down. And then in their place you see like boutiques and like cafes and fancy haircutting places, and it's just really strange for me to see because I really have no need to go into a boutique or to get a fancy haircut or it's just like a lot of new things that look interesting, but they have not much use for me and my family.
Okay, I'm going to just stop it there, but you can hear the full story online. And I think what I wanted to do by sharing this was that, at the time we were getting a lot of media and press for a lot of the anti-eviction organizing we were doing, and they would often want these sort of like, 1 minute quotes, from tenants to kind of sensationalize their stories. And what we realized was that even that, while it's important to get those stories out, they're not going to tell the more nuanced story of the neighborhood or what it means to grow up in a place and have this sort of life history approach that oral history as a method really, I think is useful for. So that's why we really were trying to work with oral history as a medium and not just have these 1 minute videos that would be a little bit more spectacular, which also are important in terms of the media. So after we produced that first oral history map, which we continue to add to, by the way, and now there's a similar one in New York and LA. We have 3 different ones. But we started producing zines and other forms of media to bring some of these stories into other kind of forms. So our first zine was actually, it's on the bottom left. It's called We Are Here. They're all free and accessible on our website. And it's a zine where we transcribe certain oral histories that we produced, but specifically like oral histories of resistance and tactics that tenants wanted to share about how they were able to fight back, and why it was also important to talk about their life histories in terms of thinking about a neighborhood or what is the neighborhood's life history, to document that and also document different resistance and histories of resistance that could continue to inform people engaging in contemporary resistance. So that's one thing that we really like to think about. We also produced this mural, what you can see on the upper right. It's a mural that has a phone number. So if you go by the mural, you can dial the phone number and hear different stories, just 5-minute excerpts of stories. That's all we could do of different tenants who were able to stay in their homes through direct action. So it's also an educational tool so people can learn about resistance. And I don't know how well you can see this. On the bottom middle is we had a dedication ceremony when we released the mural, where people whose stories were part of the mural came and shared those stories. And we also had music and people, it actually turned into a dance party. Dancing is important. And what else? Some folks in the project made this other zine called Black Exodus, which is, it's like 147 pages long. So it's more of a book than a zine, but it's free and self-published. So we're still calling it a zine, but it's specifically about Black experiences of displacement and resistance in San Francisco. And we also began experimenting with kind of like light projection work, like projecting different stories on buildings and kind of creating a dialogue. So it's just been an ongoing sort of experimentation with different narrative-based work, some of which involves mapping. Sometimes it doesn't. But what else? And then we began producing some films too. And this is a film that it's a 30-minute film called Tenants Rise Up. I'm not gonna play all of it. At first, when I was worried about filling 3 hours, I was like, oh, I'll just play the film. But what I'll play is a few different trailers from it. But really, it's an homage to tenant organizing across the Bay Area. And we realized, that in a lot of the work we're doing, we are very focused on San Francisco and Oakland. But those are just 2 cities in this Bay Area, which comprises 9 counties, and often different stories that are happening more in the margins, not in San Francisco, not in Oakland, get lost when we think about gentrification and resistance in the Bay Area. So we made this with in community partnership with lots of different groups, particularly in San Jose and in Oakland and Santa Rosa, to kind of weave together 3 different stories of resistance. The story in Oakland is a story of this woman, Auntie Francis, who's a former Black Panther who was evicted, but was able to bring together her community following the tradition of the Black Panthers in Oakland to fight back. The story in San Jose is against the new Google campus that was being built there. That has led to a lot of displacement and gentrification. And in Santa Rosa, it's a fight for rent control and more tenant protections, because not every city in the Bay Area has the same types of protections that maybe San Francisco or Oakland has. It was for us a way to really think about documenting these stories of resistance again and getting these different tactics out there and thinking about the Bay Area as more of an ecosystem of different tenant movements coming together. And there are now coalitions. There's one called the Regional Tenant Organizing Network that brings together different tenant groups across the Bay Area, and other networks and coalitions too. But that's been one of the things that we've been really involved in over the last few years, is not just focusing on San Francisco and Oakland, but building these networks to be broader, especially because we're seeing corporate landlords buy properties across the whole region, and Google buses now are going everywhere, so there's that. But again, trying to stay grounded and really putting energy into fostering these networks and coalitions. Okay, so let me go on. Another thing that we've been engaged in really since the beginning, but we continue to do it differently, is create reports, often in coalition with different housing groups in the Bay Area. So we're not, a policy advocacy group. We're not a nonprofit. We're not an NGO. We're a collective. So we're not like doing a lot of the policy work that a lot of the nonprofits are doing, but we do sometimes partner with them and do, data analysis and help make maps that can be useful in their kind of work to change policy. We're more, I think, generally committed to direct action, but are also interested in how, a multi-pronged approach can be important. So these are just some of the recent reports we made. I'll just, oh my God, this moves so fast. This is actually an online interactive report that we made with a group called the Eviction Defense Collaborative. They represent about 90% of legal cases that go to court around eviction in San Francisco. And so the thing is, there is no database of where people go after they're evicted. No government agency collects that. We have census and ACS data, but that doesn't account for evictions. We got eviction notice data from different agencies like the Rent Board, but nobody's looking to see where people end up after they're evicted or if they're able to stay in their homes. And so we found that by working with groups like the Eviction Defense Collaborative, we could create different surveys and work with tenants to see where they were or where they ended up after being evicted. And so this is an early map we made where we followed up with 700 tenants who were evicted in 2012 to see where they were in 2015. And, a lot of this provided, we did these little infographics, and this was part of a report that the Eviction Defense Collaborative used, and we could start to map where people were ending up, both within the city, but also, sorry, this is going slow. Let me just kind of get out of it. Yeah, where people ended up after being forced out of the city. So this was just based on survey data, again, because there is no database of this. And I think it is important to show that when people get evicted, about 50% of these folks who got evicted were not able to stay in the city, and some people actually ended up having to leave the state altogether. So again, this is a way that we used a different kind of data and worked with a community partner to understand another kind of angle as to what was happening with gentrification. We also found that 14 folks were unhoused, although I think the number is probably a lot greater. It's hard to, reach folks a lot of times after folks become unhoused. But of the folks we were able to call, 14 said that they were. We also found out that 2 people had passed away, but that number could be higher too. But that's just an example of one report that we made. We also were able to work with the Eviction Defense Collaborative to analyze, how racist evictions are. We found that 300% of evictions, Black tenants in San Francisco were overrepresented by 300% when it came to who was being evicted, which is huge. And Latinx tenants also are highly overrepresented, whereas white tenants underrepresented. So we already kind of know this by doing housing organizing, but sometimes this sort of data can be useful in pushing back against policy and informing a narrative that this is a highly racist process. So that's something else that we've done. We've also, created little infographics like this to show how the eviction process works, because it's really complicated and people don't really, I still get confused by it. There are all these loopholes and avenues if you get an eviction notice as to what happens. So we try to do a lot of this kind of more popular educational work to help, tenants and housing groups understand the process and how to fight back. We've done reports where we've analyzed, correlations between Airbnbs and evictions, and we've tried to match evictors to Airbnb units, mostly based on what tenants themselves have reported in their neighborhoods. We've done reports looking at the banks that finance evictors. So we have this one partner called the California Reinvestment Coalition, and they try to hold big banks accountable. There's this Reinvestment Act where, because of histories of redlining, certain communities were not invested in. And so now banks are supposedly trying to undo their harmful legacies by investing in areas that they used to not invest in. But what we're seeing is they're actually just investing in corporate landlords in those neighborhoods and not, fulfilling what they're supposed to be fulfilling contractually. So by looking at the banks themselves financing evictors, this group has been able to take some of them to court and challenge them and try to make them a little less horrible, even though they're so horrible. So this is just some of the way that data analysis can be useful in fighting back. We've also been pushing for more protections around SROs, which I do have SROs in Montreal. Yes, single residency occupancies. SROs have had fewer protections than they should. And what we've been seeing, for instance, in Oakland is that a lot of SROs, which house historically very folks who have precarious housing, it's often a last resort. But what we're seeing is that SRO units are being evicted and being turned into these kind of tech dorms, or kind of somebody called them digerati dorms or tech hostels. But basically, you pay $2,000 a month to live in a bunk bed so you can meet another venture capitalist and incubate your project, that sort of thing. So we started to do some work with different groups fighting for more SRO protections, and just following stories like this is the Travelers Hotel in Oakland, which it did exactly that. It became this sort of tech dorm. So that's an example of kind of using story mapping and reporting to help push for policy change. This is a really recent report we published in Berkeley. So is there a YIMBY movement here? I'm using all these terms. Yes, in my backyard. Some people yes, some people no. So this is kind of a side story. Okay. But back when we started in 2013, in 2013, the next year, another group formed in San Francisco called the Bay Area Renters Federation. They call themselves SF BARF. I can go on. I could talk about them for hours and hours. But we really thought that they were just kind of a joke, and they were going to grow this big movement that's now called the Yes in My Backyard YIMBY movement. But they're now international in scope in terms of this network. But their kind of basic premise is that the free market will solve gentrification. And so basically by just developing more housing at whatever market rate, luxury, any kind of housing, we'll create enough housing and therefore there won't be gentrification. It doesn't make sense. They believe in trickle down ergonomics, but the point is that they have a lot of capital, they have a lot of influence on social media, and they have a lot of support from now state politicians in California, also local politicians in San Francisco. What they do is they position anybody who doesn't want luxury apartments as NIMBY, not in my backyard, which is a historically kind of racist category of people who are trying to protect their backyards from other people. So what they're doing is calling like often working class housing organizers NIMBYs in order to kind of brush them aside and position themselves as the YIMBY saviors. And so anyway, this is like, this takes up a lot of space and energy in the housing movement in San Francisco and in California. And what we're seeing now is different cities basically get mandated that they have to build more housing by the state because of the power of this movement. But sometimes when housing is below market rate or affordable or social housing or public housing, that can be really helpful. But building a bunch of new, market rate or luxury condos isn't going to solve the problem. And in fact, there's enough housing in San Francisco and in Oakland to house everybody who needs homes, but it's just being reserved for people with a lot of money. So anyway, so what's also interesting is that UC Berkeley has different research groups that are part of this EMB movement and keep on publishing all of these reports that are encouraging the city to build more market rate and luxury housing. And so the rent board reached out to us and was like, hey, can you make a kind of counter report showing that by just building whatever, luxury buildings, it's not going to solve anything. So we try to kind of fill this sort of gap where sometimes universities and nonprofit, are actually pushing for some of these policies that can be quite disastrous. Sometimes not. But this is one of the areas that we're trying to push back on and think about kind of creating these counter reports against gentrification. So anyway, that's another thing we do. And okay, one of these, this is a different report that we made back in 2016, but it's an online interactive report that actually weaves together oral histories and narratives, with data analysis, and it's called Counterpoints. We made it in collaboration with different housing groups, but also arts-based groups. So there, you can see there's like video, and this was actually a report when we were able to first identify who the top landlords in San Francisco were. It also has, let me find it, a community power map, where we worked with different tenants to map sites of power and community assets rather than just kind of the negative things we often map. And this was for us an important intervention too, in kind of rethinking about space and mapping, not from this sort of negative, all of this loss is happening, but really from look at all of the amazing places and people that are here. And so, yeah, this report was really important to us. It was called Counterpoints. And it actually inspired us to then, this is like going so fast, to create an atlas, which was also inspired by our friends at Collective Orangutango, who we'll talk later, who have an amazing atlas that we got to be a part of. But we created this community-based atlas where we basically had a call for submissions, and different folks in the community, artists, poets, photographers, map makers contributed different contributions. We had about 150 contributions come in, and I think probably the two of you can relate. It became a really big project of how do we create an atlas with all of these stories. We also wanted to turn some of our digital media and maps into something more kind of like graphic design based that we could include in the atlas, and that ended up being really hard, but we did it. At the end of the day, these names are on the right are just mapping project folks, not all of the other people who also contributed to our atlas. But it came out in 2021. You can find it with PM Press, and we really wanted to use like a lefty activist-based press and not an academic university-based press. There are 7 chapters, and each chapter has about 20 chapters. So kind of we made like 7 books smashed into one. I'll just show you what the 7 main chapters are, so you can also sort of see how we're conceptualizing the different. Well, when we thought about displacement and resistance, we were like, what are the different chapters? I mean, everything's connected. There are so many different angles we're trying to approach, and it became this year-long process to just figure out what are the 7 kind of thematic chapters. But anyway, the first one is on evictions and root shock, which has a lot to do with maps that we had already made that we converted. So that exploding LSAC map that I showed you before, that's actually right here on the right. If we wanted to kind of dial it down and make it kind of one-dimensional. We have a second big chapter on indigenous geographies of resistance, and we did that in close partnership with a group called the Socorro Land Trust. And they're an Ohlone are the native people to a lot of the Bay Area. They have this amazing land trust where they're trying to rematriate stolen land. And they also are asking settlers to pay a tax, a settler tax, so that they can actually reclaim land that was taken from them. And so we did a lot of mapping with them to think about indigenous geographies of resistance. We have a chapter on health and environmental justice, which looks at everything from environmental racism to kind of creating radical community gardens. There's a chapter on gentrification and state violence, where we're looking at the intersections of the police and the carceral state with gentrification, looking at how unhoused folks are disproportionately criminalized and incarcerated by law enforcement. And we're also looking at abolitionist efforts to abolish the police and abolish private property. There's a chapter on transportation, infrastructure, and economy, where we're looking at like the Google bus blockades, but also just, again, if somebody's evicted from the city, like what happens to commute times, how are people getting back to the city, or if they are after they're being displaced? Also, what are flows of capital throughout the city infrastructure? There's a chapter in migrations and relocations. And here we're looking at the different, the Bay Area has been, San Francisco has been a sanctuary city. So a lot of folks who have been, who maybe have escaped or left different contexts of violence elsewhere find their way to San Francisco, but then suddenly are forced to leave because of gentrification. So we're looking at that and how that works. And then the last chapter is on speculation and speculative futures. And so we're looking at like financial speculation or the financialization of housing, as some people call it, basically that whole problem of shell companies and developers and big investment companies basically turning our homes into commodities. But we're also looking at other sort of speculative futures and imaginaries. So this is on the right, a map made by a 5th grade elementary school students who try to remap and re-envision like the San Francisco that they want to live in. And so that to us was also really important, kind of reimagining and re-envisioning. All right, going through things. Okay, so I'm gonna do a couple of pivots. I don't want to bore you all too much. Are you all bored, or should I keep going? All right. Yeah, I could keep going forever. I know this is a long workshop. I'm going to share a little bit now about some work that we've done in LA and New York and how those chapters are approaching mapping and fighting gentrification. Then I'm going to share a little bit about some tools that we've been making lately. And then I think what I'll do is pause and see if folks have any questions about data. And then if we have time, I can share a little bit about the Landlord Tech Watch project, which is a project that I've been working on to kind of understand the different surveillance technologies that landlords and property managers use to collect data about tenants and sometimes automate the context of evictions. So we can just kind of see how far we go before you all fall asleep. But sound good? Any questions so far about any of this? Take a deep breath. All right. Okay. Oh, there's a question on that. Oh, yeah. Let's see. Thank you. Oh, yeah. Austin. Okay. Well, I should talk to you about Austin because I live there now. So, okay. So in 2017, we started chapters in LA and New York, and we had no intention of like growing. But what happened was that some folks in our collective who were from those cities kind of went back home and or to grad school. And I think what we saw in both of those chapters was that it wasn't that folks just like left the Bay Area and went to LA or to New York and were like, we're going to just copy everything that we did in the Bay Area and kind of, do the same thing. But folks spent some time, like sometimes a couple of years, really trying to understand what was already happening and was there a need that folks could fulfill, and were there different community partnerships that they could engage in that would support local efforts rather than kind of step on toes of existing struggles. So in LA, like there was a lot of work at the time in this neighborhood called Boyle Heights against art washing. So what was happening was New York galleries were moving to LA and to Boyle Heights, which is a Latinx neighborhood, and people there in Boyle Heights really saw the galleries as one of the main culprits behind gentrification. So it wasn't, I mean, it was, but it wasn't just tech, but in this case, it was galleries. So this was an important thing to kind of start mapping and thinking about. There also the LAPD, there are certain groups like Stop LAPD Spying and others who have been really looking at intersections between policing and evictions there. And so we started doing story mapping there to kind of understand how nuisance evictions, which are basically evictions when your landlord or neighbors snitch on you and say you're a nuisance, which is again highly racialized, get reported to the police. So we started like studying that and trying to map that and support some of those efforts. And then in New York, we started, there's a group called Just Fix NYC who is already doing a lot of important and exciting housing data mapping. But we started to work with them to kind of make these like forced evictors lists, which get updated every year. And now we're actually trying to make one of these for the Bay Area too. But you can kind of see who the top evictors are here during the pandemic, and all the banks that fund them, any lawsuits they're a part of. You can also see a map of all the different properties that they own, which might take a second to load. But this is a way, again, that we're sort of combining some of that early kind of analysis about corporate landlords and who's behind them to this kind of one more singular platform. And again, trying to bring like these faces that are trying to hide often behind the shell companies to bear. And I was living in New York for a couple of years in 2019 and 2020. And right before the pandemic, there was this amazing tribunal that we were a part of with a bunch of different groups where we brought tenants together and made these sort of mock effigy, like cardboard statues of these landlords, and held these landlords in this sort of people's tribunal. And it was actually really a powerful and exciting event because people were able to, vent their frustrations, but also connect with other tenants who were being evicted by the same kind of slumlord or serial evictor. So again, this is a way that I see some of this work being powerful, not just in naming names, but in actually bringing people together to fight back. So that's what this project has been doing. Also during the pandemic, we began doing mapping of the different tenant protections that were being enacted globally. And some of we started to try to analyze how strong or weak those protections were. And we began doing some oral histories with folks who were being evicted. But this, I would say, and Paul was part of this too, this project was in some ways, I would say, a failure, but also a learning experience. We had great community partnerships with some groups in different parts of the world, but not everywhere, obviously. So it's a map that's really uneven in terms of what's represented. But also, we started having people join the collective from that weren't part of our existing chapters, because suddenly we had all moved to Zoom. And so it became this kind of weird project where we kept on, I don't know. I think we learned a lot. And I think we learned about how making these sort of global maps actually isn't useful or beneficial and can actually sometimes do more harm than good. But at the same time, we were able to do a lot of mapping in certain places where we had connections. And I'm bringing this up because there's another project in the US, called the Eviction Lab. I don't know if anybody's heard of them. That's on Matthew Desmond's Eviction Lab. So this is a project where Matthew Desmond, who's a sociologist, based at Princeton right now, he has this eviction lab, and they're also trying to map evictions across the US. But what they're doing is using this sort of universal method of acquiring eviction data from mostly data broker companies like LexisNexis. And what they're doing is they're purchasing this data and then just kind of mapping it and analyzing it. But the problem is that in the US, at least, each state and each county has a different policy in terms of what eviction data it makes public or keeps kind of private. And so by just using these sort of more kind of global methods of acquiring data, the analysis is quite wrong. And so early on when he started this project, he would go to cities like Portland, Oregon, and be like, oh, you don't have an eviction problem here, whereas actually they do. It's just that his data doesn't show that. So again, this gets at some of the problems with like scaling this sort of eviction mapping, especially when the data is so localized. And again, this is why we've realized it's better to just sort of map where you have these connections already and not do this big global thing. And then, okay, this is the last, I guess, mapping project thing I'll show you. We've also been working on this tool called Evictorbook, which only works in San Francisco and Oakland. And it's essentially, it's a lookup tool. So remember that like urban green map I showed you where you could see all the different LLCs and properties. We realized we wanted to be able to create a tool where we could do this for any property in the city. So you could look up an address and see all the different properties associated with it, and the shell companies and eviction histories. And so we created this tool called Evictorbook. So you can search for an address and see, okay, 1021 Campbell Street. It's actually connected to all of these properties here. You can learn about the different evictions that have taken place in them, different complaints about the landlord, but also you can, I'll just go here. You can just see right away, like, oh, this is how all of these properties and people are connected, these shell companies, and kind of use this as a research tool. And it turns out that this Justin Walway is the main landlord here behind this ownership network. And this is by far the most complicated thing we've ever built or done. And we're still trying to get it better. And we're doing these workshops with community groups to improve it. We keep on asking if we can build more of these for other cities. And we're just like, we're just trying to keep it going in the places where we exist. But we are trying to open source the code so that it could be, potentially copied or if it would be useful for folks in different contexts to make something like this. But what I can show you is what we're doing is getting data from all of these sources, which I know isn't going to translate to different contexts that have different types of data, but essentially we're getting eviction data from these local rent boards, sometimes from sheriff's departments, and we're getting parcel data from the county, kind of these cadastral maps of ownership. And then we're getting what's called Secretary of State, but basically data about corporations and their different shell companies from the state. And we're like basically connecting all the data. It's a lot more complicated than that. This is a sort of simplified version, but to really understand again who is evicting whom. And that's again kind of the initial thing that we wanted to solve when we began. We're still trying to get better at it, but at least now we're not having to just do like one at a time, slowly, because we never get very far doing it that way. But anyway, there's a lot we can improve with this tool. And this is kind of most of my time in the mapping project over the last couple of years has been really going into this in particular. There's one other tool called the Tenant Power Toolkit that the mapping project in LA has made with the Debt Collective. And yeah, basically it's a way that if somebody gets an eviction notice, they can get hooked up with resources and have help answering that eviction notice more automatically. And the Debt Collective got really interested in this in the pandemic because the kind of rental debt that now tenants have, that's going to be really hard to pay back. Like if you haven't paid rent for a couple of years, now suddenly people are going to get evicted. They're already getting evicted for that. So we've been trying to think about debt with the Debt Collective, which is a US-based organization that has been trying to form debtors unions and now in collaboration with tenants unions to basically fight back against debt. So that's some of the work that's happening in LA.